Smoke, heat, splintered wood. For a moment that felt like the tearing of history itself, the world inside the wooden conference hut at the Wolf's Lair vanished in a flash of white fire. Chairs shattered, maps burst into flame, and men who had been standing upright only seconds earlier were thrown like broken dolls across the room. Outside, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg paused mid-stride. At 12:42 p.m., the explosion thundered across the East Prussian forest, and in that instant he believed truly, completely, that Adolf Hitler was dead. He had done it. The war would finally end. Germany might yet escape total ruin. But the story of how that moment came to be the courage, the desperation, the bitter years that led a group of German officers to turn against their own leader began long before the smoke cleared on that July afternoon. In the early years of Hitler's rule, many Germans embraced him as a savior who promised stability after the humiliation of World War I. But beneath the enthusiasm, a quiet circle of military traditionalists, aristocrats, and intellectuals began to recognize the danger he posed. Men like General Ludwig Beck, the dignified former chief of the General Staff, saw in Hitler not strength, but reckless ambition. Beck resigned in 1938 after warning that Hitler's plans for aggression would lead Germany into catastrophe. Others, like Major General Henning von Tresckow, witnessed the atrocities unfolding on the Eastern Front and felt their moral convictions corrode with each burned village and murdered civilian. By 1943, these men had reached the same conclusion. Hitler had to die for Germany to survive. Yet deciding was not doing. Hitler was surrounded by layers of hardened security. He appeared without warning, changed schedules abruptly, and trusted almost no one. Several attempts came painfully close. Tresckow placed a bomb disguised as a bottle of liquor on Hitler's plane in March 1943, only for the device to fail due to the freezing altitude. Weeks later, Colonel Rudolf von Gersdorf carried explosives into a Berlin exhibition Hitler was scheduled to tour for half an hour. Hitler rushed through in barely 2 minutes, leaving Gersdorf sweating in a bathroom stall, desperately dismantling the fuse before it blew him apart. Each failed attempt tightened the noose of suspicion and fear. And still, they persisted. What the conspirators lacked was someone with unquestioned access to Hitler, the courage to kill him, and the physical ability to arm and place a bomb. The answer came in the form of a wounded hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg. Aristocratic, brilliant, and deeply patriotic. Stauffenberg had been severely injured in Tunisia in 1943, losing his right hand, his left eye, and 2 fingers on his remaining hand. But his mind remained sharp, and his resolve only hardened as the war turned increasingly senseless. Appointed Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, a position that granted direct access to Hitler, he joined the conspiracy with a conviction that Germany's honor demanded action. The plan he helped refine, code-named Operation Valkyrie, originally existed as a contingency to preserve order if Allied bombing or internal revolt disrupted the government. Stauffenberg and his allies engineered it into a mechanism for a coup. Once Hitler was confirmed dead, they would mobilize reserve units, arrest the Nazi leadership, seize communication centers, and present the takeover as an emergency response to an SS uprising. It was elegant in theory, terrifying in practice. Success required flawless coordination. A single delay, a single misunderstanding could doom them all. Twice in July 1944, Stauffenberg carried a bomb to meetings with Hitler. Twice, circumstances slipped out of alignment, Hermann Göring or Heinrich Himmler failed to appear, or the meeting was cancelled outright. The conspirators knew the Gestapo was tightening its grip. If they did not act soon, they would be discovered and executed without accomplishing anything. So, when Stauffenberg boarded a plane on the morning of July 20th, with 2 British-made explosives and his loyal aide Werner von Haiften beside him, he did so knowing that failure would mean his death and likely the deaths of everyone he cared for. The Wolf's Lair was stifling that day. The July heat forced the staff to abandon Hitler's usual fortified bunker in favor of a wooden conference hut, with open windows, an architectural detail that would later decide the fate of the world. As officers gathered around the massive oak map table, Stauffenberg excused himself to a side room and, with Haiften's help, armed only one of the 2 bombs. A guard's unexpected interruption had stolen the time needed to prepare the second charge. Holding the briefcase by its handleless edge, Stauffenberg stepped back into the conference room, eased it beneath the table, and positioned it less than 6 feet from Hitler's boots. He offered a quiet apology and claimed he had a phone call to return. No one questioned him as he departed. At 12:40 p.m., he walked briskly toward a bunker a safe distance away, sweat gathering beneath his collar, heart pounding not from fear, but from belief. This time, it would work. This time, Germany would be freed. 2 minutes later, the bomb exploded. The explosion ripped through the wooden hut like a living thing, hurling splinters, smoke, and bodies outward in a violent plume. For an instant, Stauffenberg stood motionless, gripping the railing of a nearby bunker as the blast rolled across the compound. The roar shook the trees, and a column of dust surged upward as though the earth itself had erupted. There was no doubt in his mind. No one could survive such force in an enclosed room. He turned away, heart hammering, and hurried back toward the car where Haeften waited. They navigated 3 security checkpoints with a mixture of confidence and desperation, insisting they had urgent business in Berlin. At 1:15 p.m., their plane lifted from the Wolf Lair runway, carrying them toward a future that seemed, for a moment, already won. But inside the shattered conference hut, reality was far different. The bomb had detonated, yes, but it had not killed Hitler. By a stroke of chance that would be retold endlessly by Nazi propaganda as proof of divine protection, Colonel Heinz Brandt, moments before the blast, had nudged Stauffenberg's briefcase behind one of the table's thick oak supports. That single action, casual and unconscious, shifted the explosive far enough that when it detonated, the table leg absorbed the brunt of the blast directed toward Hitler. The open windows, chosen for ventilation in the oppressive heat, allowed the shockwave to escape instead of ricocheting inward. When the smoke cleared, 4 officers lay mortally wounded, bodies broken. 20 more groaned beneath rubble and splinters. And at the center of the destruction stood Hitler, stunned, bleeding from both eardrums, his hair singed, his trousers shredded, but alive. Within minutes, he was walking, supported by aides, but conscious and furious. His survival ignited a surge of panic across the Wolf's Lair, but even more dangerously, it began a chain reaction that would catch the conspirators in Berlin entirely off guard. Stauffenberg and Haeften, unaware of this unfolding nightmare, landed in Berlin with the certainty that events were moving exactly as planned. Operation Valkyrie was ready to unfold. Hitler was dead. He must be dead, and the time for action had arrived. In Berlin, however, confusion reigned. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army and a man whose loyalties bent wherever danger threatened, refused to activate Valkyrie without confirmation of Hitler's death. Calls from the Wolf's Lair were chaotic. Reports contradicted one another. Some claimed Hitler had been seriously wounded, others that he was dead, still others that he had survived. The conspirators needed decisive action, but without Fromm's cooperation, mobilizing the Reserve Army was nearly impossible. Time slipped by. Each minute of hesitation tightened the noose. It was General Friedrich Olbricht who finally broke the paralysis. Knowing delay meant failure, he began issuing orders in Hitler's name shortly after 4 p.m., activating Valkyrie and setting in motion the first movements of the coup. Reserve Army units began seizing key locations. Communications offices were isolated. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel swiftly arrested over 200 SS and Gestapo personnel. For a brief moment, it looked as if momentum might carry the conspirators to success even without Hitler's confirmed death. The Third Reich's vast machinery relied so heavily on assumed obedience that even a hint of fractured authority caused rapid disarray. But the illusion collapsed at 6:30 p.m., when Hitler's voice crackled through radio transmissions across Germany. Furious, trembling with rage, he announced that he had survived an assassination attempt orchestrated by a small clique of criminal traitors. His voice, unmistakable, destroyed the conspirators' central claim and shattered the fragile facade of the coup. Officers who had followed Valkyrie orders turned instantly, some out of loyalty, others out of fear of being implicated. Momentum reversed like a tide, sweeping the conspirators backward into chaos. At the Bendler Block in Berlin, the heart of the Reserve Army headquarters, Stauffenberg arrived to find confusion erupting everywhere. Arguments raged in hallways. Officers who had pledged support in private now demanded proof that Hitler was dead. Fromm, sensing disaster, reasserted control and declared his loyalty to Hitler, arresting the very men he had once covertly tolerated. Gunfire echoed in the courtyard as loyalists and conspirators struggled for control. Stauffenberg, still convinced his bomb had succeeded until the very last moment, refused to believe the coup was lost. But the evidence became undeniable. Units once under their command now surrounded the building, and messages from the Wolf Lair confirmed the worst: Hitler lived. Fromm, desperate to distance himself from the conspiracy and save his own life, moved quickly. He convened a hasty court-martial in the dimly lit hallways of the Bender block. There was no defense, no deliberation, only a sentence already decided. By 11 p.m., Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and 2 other conspirators were dragged into the courtyard. The night air was heavy with the smell of dust and cordite. A firing squad faced them beneath flickering lantern light. In the last seconds before the rifles cracked, Stauffenberg cried out, "Long live sacred Germany!" Words that cut through the silence like a final declaration of belief. Shots rang out. The coup was over. The Benderblock courtyard fell silent after the final volley. Lanterns flickered against the walls as the bodies of the conspirators slumped to the ground, shadows stretching long over the cobblestones. But the night was far from over. Even as Stauffenberg's last words faded into the darkness, the machinery of Nazi vengeance snapped into motion with cold precision. Hitler, trembling with outrage, demanded retribution so sweeping and merciless that no spark of rebellion could ever ignite again. What followed was not merely a crackdown. It was a purge meant to erase the very idea of resistance. The Gestapo spread through Berlin like a dark tide. They arrested military officers, civil servants, clergy, diplomats, and anyone whose name surfaced in interrogations, sometimes from truth, sometimes from desperate invention. Tresckow, far away on the Eastern Front when he learned of the plot's failure, chose not to be captured. On the night of July 21st, he walked toward the front line and detonated a hand grenade against his chest. Before he died, he handed his aide a final message. The assassination must be attempted even if it failed, because the world needed to know that not all Germans followed Hitler willingly. In Berlin, the Gestapo's interrogations grew increasingly brutal. Prisoners were tortured, forced to name associates, coerced into implicating friends and family. Under the doctrine of Sippenhaft-Kin liability, wives, children, and elderly parents were taken away. Some were sent to concentration camps, others to orphanages under false names. The conspirators had known this possibility. Many had tried to shield their families by telling them nothing. It made no difference. Hitler wanted the punishment to extend across generations. The trials that followed were held before the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, presided over by Judge Roland Freisler, a man whose shrill voice and theatrical cruelty seemed designed to humiliate rather than judge. Defendants were denied belts or suspenders, so their pants sagged humiliatingly in the courtroom. Freisler screamed insults, refused them the chance to speak, and delivered sentences before hearings even began. He hurled documents, pounded desks, and turned the proceedings into grotesque spectacles. Every moment was filmed to be shown to military units as a warning. To Hitler, it was not enough to kill the conspirators. Their dignity had to be destroyed as well. General Erich Hoppner, who had briefly seized command during the coup attempt, was hanged within 24 hours of his sham trial. Others followed. The execution chamber at Plötzensee prison became a place of unrelenting horror. Prisoners were hung from meat hooks with piano wire, forced to die slowly in agony rather than by traditional hanging. Hitler requested that the killings be filmed so he could watch them personally. The cruelty was deliberate. It was meant to grind the last fragments of resistance into dust. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's famed desert fox, was ensnared. Rommel had not been directly involved in the plot, but he had expressed criticism of Hitler and entertained discussions about negotiating peace. That was enough. Unable to publicly execute a national hero, Hitler offered him a choice: suicide with full military honors and protection for his family, or a public trial, followed by execution and disgrace. On October 14th, 1944, Rommel swallowed poison, while 2 generals waited outside his home. His death was announced as the result of wounds from an Allied air attack. By the spring of 1945, roughly 200 people connected to the conspiracy had been executed, though historians believe the true number was higher, Many others simply vanished into camps. Yet, even as the terror intensified, Hitler's regime grew increasingly unstable. The officer corps, once a bastion of professionalism, was rocked by paranoia. Hitler no longer trusted generals of traditional Prussian background. He replaced them with hardline loyalists and political extremists. Himmler, a man with no military training, was appointed commander of the Reserve Army. Officers entering Hitler's presence were now required to surrender their weapons at the door. The martial heritage of the German army, already eroded by years of Nazi influence, dissolved completely in the war's final months. The consequences of the failed plot extended far beyond the conspirators' deaths. By mid-1944, Germany had already lost the war. Its defeat was inevitable, but the pace and scale of destruction still depended on its leadership. After July 20th, Hitler's paranoia metastasized. He refused tactical withdrawals, demanded suicidal offensives, and unleashed reprisals against civilians across occupied Europe. The war dragged on for 9 more months, months in which countless lives were lost. Historians estimate that more American soldiers died after July 20th, 1944 than before it. Cities across Germany, from Hamburg to Dresden, were reduced to ash. And the Holocaust did not slow. Tens of thousands more were murdered as the Nazi leadership raced toward obliteration. Yet even in the face of devastation, the moral legacy of the July 20th conspirators began to take shape. They had not been perfect heroes. Many had served the regime loyally for years. Some were complicit in atrocities on the Eastern Front. Their motives varied from patriotism to pragmatism to disgust. And yet, when the moment came, they acted knowing that failure meant death not just for themselves, but for their families. Their resistance stood as proof that even within a dictatorship built on fear, obedience, and indoctrination, conscience could still flicker. Outside the Benderblock courtyard, in the streets of Berlin, the city trembled beneath the weight of retribution. But inside the walls where Stauffenberg had died, something else lingered. The first fragile shape of a legacy not yet understood. In the final months of the war, as Soviet artillery thundered closer to Berlin and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine, the consequences of the failed July 20th plot settled across Germany like a long, dark shadow. The officer corps, once a disciplined institution rooted in centuries of tradition, now lived in fear of its own leader. Any hesitation, any misinterpreted gesture, any stray remark could bring accusations of disloyalty. Commanders were dismissed, replaced with sycophants who echoed Hitler's delusions instead of challenging them. Retreats that could have saved lives were forbidden. Civilians defending their burning neighborhoods were expected to fight to the last breath. Even as defeat became unmistakable, Hitler insisted that Germany must perish with him rather than surrender. If the conspirators had succeeded, the war might have ended before the devastation of late 1944 and early 1945. But their failure ensured the worst outcome, a regime unrestrained in its paranoia, lashing out as it collapsed. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, families fled through winter snows as front lines dissolved. And in the concentration camps, the machinery of murder continued until Allied troops arrived at the gates. Cities across Germany, from Hamburg to Dresden, were reduced to ash. And the Holocaust did not slow. Tens of thousands more were murdered as the Nazi leadership raced toward obliteration. Yet even in the face of devastation, the moral legacy of the July 20th conspirators began to take shape. They had not been perfect heroes. Many had served the regime loyally for years. Some were complicit in atrocities on the Eastern Front. Their motives varied from patriotism to pragmatism to disgust. The world would later understand that the conspirators had not acted out of naive optimism. They had acted because they knew that with every day Hitler remained alive, Germany bled more deeply. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Germany lay shattered. Millions were dead, borders redrawn, cities unrecognizable. In the immediate aftermath, the July 20th conspirators were not universally hailed as heroes. Historians revisited the story of the resistance. Families of the executed conspirators finally learned the fates of their loved ones. Soldiers who had once repeated lines about loyalty and obedience were confronted with the question of conscience. And slowly, the legacy of men like Beck, Tresckow, and Stauffenberg emerged from the ruins. Their legacy was not simple. Stauffenberg himself was a man of contradictions, brilliant, nationalistic, courageous, yet once supportive of policies he would later oppose. Beck had warned of catastrophe, but lacked the boldness to act alone. Tresckow, the moral core of the resistance, had served on a front where atrocities were committed daily. Their network included conservatives, aristocrats, bureaucrats, and officers, many of whom carried their own shadows. They were not pure heroes, but they were men who, when confronted with the full horror of Hitler's rule, refused to look away. As West Germany formed its new democratic identity, the conspirators came to symbolize a crucial truth. Resistance had existed. Not all Germans had followed Hitler into madness. Not all had remained silent. Their story offered a way to teach younger generations that obedience without conscience can lead to catastrophe, and that even in a totalitarian state, moral responsibility does not disappear. In 1953, the Bender Block courtyard, where Stauffenberg and others were executed, became a memorial site. A bronze statue of a bound man stands there now, a stark reminder of human defiance in the face of tyranny. Each year on July 20th, Germany's defense minister delivers a speech honoring the conspirators. New soldiers in the Bundeswehr, Germany's post-war military, take an oath not simply to defend the country, but to uphold human dignity and the constitutional order. They are taught explicitly that they must refuse illegal orders even from their superiors. This principle, born from the ashes of the July 20th plot, forms the ethical backbone of Germany's modern armed forces. The story of Operation Valkyrie is sometimes misunderstood as a dramatic last-minute gamble. It was far more than that. It was the culmination of years of hesitation, moral struggle, and worsening dread as Hitler dragged the country deeper into destruction. It was the work of flawed men who recognized too late the monster they had served. But once they recognized it, they acted with courage unmatched by the millions who looked away. Their failure cost them their lives. Their attempt saved Germany's conscience. Stauffenberg's bomb did not kill Hitler, but it ruptured the myth of total obedience inside the German military. It exposed the regime's fragile undercurrents of fear, and it set a precedent that future generations could look to with pride instead of shame. The conspirators did not live to see the Germany they hoped for, but they helped make it possible. History often remembers victories. Yet sometimes the noblest acts are those that fail. The July 20th plot stands as a reminder that even when the odds are impossible, the attempt to do what is right still matters. The conspirators faced death with the knowledge that their actions might never bear fruit. They acted anyway. Their moral courage, imperfect but undeniable, survives long after the regime they fought perished in fire. In the decades that followed, historians, philosophers, and ordinary citizens continued to debate the meaning of the July 20th plot. Some argue that the conspirators acted too late, that by 1944 the regime was already collapsing, and their attempt, while courageous, could no longer alter the fate of Europe. Others believed the men had been motivated too much by patriotism and too little by outrage at the Holocaust, pointing out that many of them had once supported Hitler's early policies. But these criticisms, while important in understanding their complexity, did not erase the fundamental truth that lay at the heart of their actions. When confronted with a choice between obedience and conscience, they chose conscience. What made their choice extraordinary was not simply its danger, but its isolation. They had no guarantee of support. They had no assurance that the German people, still influenced by propaganda and fearful of reprisals, would rise behind them. They were not backed by armies or political movements, but by small circles of trust forged in whispers. Their meetings were fraught with fear, their communications coded and fleeting. At any moment, a careless word or a single traitor could doom them all. Yet they persisted, convinced that even an unsuccessful attempt would serve a purpose greater than survival. Germany's post-war generations would later confront a painful question. Why did so few resist? Why did millions follow orders without hesitation? The July 20th conspirators provided one answer, not a comfortable one, but a necessary one. Resistance is difficult. It demands sacrifice far beyond what most people are willing to give. It demands the surrender of safety, family, reputation, and life itself. The conspirators' refusal to remain silent stood as a living critique of the nation's earlier obedience. Their courage became a mirror in which future Germans were forced to see both the failures and the possibilities of their own history. When the 2008 film Valkyrie introduced Stauffenberg's story to a global audience, millions saw for the first time the human side of the plot. The tension, the fear, the hope, the tragic miscalculations. Yet even that dramatization could not fully capture the weight that hung over the conspirators, the knowledge that they were gambling not just with their lives, but with their families' futures. Nor could it capture the quieter moral struggle of men like Tresckow, whose soul had been shaped and scarred by the brutality he witnessed on the Eastern Front. These men were not examples of purity. They were examples of transformation, of conscience awakening slowly in the midst of horror. Today, at the Bendler Block Memorial, visitors walk the same courtyard stones where Stauffenberg and his comrades were shot shortly before midnight on July 20th, 1944. The walls are unchanged, the air still and somber. A plaque bears their names. The bronze figure of the bound man stands beneath the sky, eternal and silent. Tourists stand quietly, school children file past with wide eyes, and soldiers of the modern German military return year after year to take their oaths of service. The ceremony is brief, the words formal, but its message echoes with force. Never again blind obedience. Never again loyalty without conscience. Never again a state in which moral courage is treated as treason. This is the true legacy of the July 20th plot. Not the explosion that failed to kill Hitler, but the lesson it carved into the memory of a nation that resistance is not defined by success, but by the willingness to act when action is necessary. The conspirators tried to kill a tyrant not because they believed they would win, but because they believed it was right. Their story endures because it offers a moral compass calibrated not by victory, but by responsibility. Stauffenberg once wrote that the man who stands idly by becomes guilty through his silence. In the end, he chose not to remain silent. His words, shouted moments before the bullets struck, "Long live sacred Germany," were not a call to nationalism, but to a Germany that could exist only if built upon conscience and dignity. He did not live to see such a nation, but his actions helped lay its foundation. The July 20th conspirators failed to stop Hitler, yet their failure does not diminish their meaning. If anything, it magnifies it. They remind us that moral courage is measured not by the likelihood of success, but by the refusal to surrender to fear. They show that even in the darkest moments of history, there are always those who choose the harder path, who stand against power not for glory, but for principle. Their story remains a testament to the idea that the attempt to do what is right is itself a victory, one that echoes far beyond the moment it occurs. Thank you for watching this story brought back to life. If it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive for generations to come.